Welcome everybody to another session of Village Torah. We are now in we've got all the holidays behind us. We are now starting at the very beginning, Parashat Beresheet. We're starting at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, back at the beginning. So last year I discussed the creation of man, creation of Adam Harishon, the first person, Adam and Eve. This year I want to go a little bit beyond that. Another, I think, a fairly familiar story to many, if not most. I don't necessarily want to say all, but it could be everybody listening to this, which is the story about the eating of the fruit. Sort of, I think what people have come to colloquially call it as the forbidden fruit. So what is that? So we're going to explore this. So we're going to check out what the Torah actually says, what we have in this week's Torah portion, insofar as what is this fruit? As we're going to see, it is not clear. It is definitely not clear. So we start off in Genesis chapter 2. This is where this verse pops up that, okay, so the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it. For as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. Okay, so we get that. And then there's this, then we go off talking about it is not good for man to be alone. Okay, so we talk about this, and it's the creation of a help meet, which ends up being Eve or Chava. So then we come back to the story about this tree at the beginning of this third chapter, and it starts off by talking about the serpent. Hanachash haya arum mikol chaya hasadeh. The serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts. Now, I will point out one word which I'm going to get back to a little bit later, but it's not clear in the English, but the Hebrew is fascinating the way it describes the serpent or the snake in contrast to all the other animals, which is haya arum. Now we'll get back to this, and that's one of the curious words here. But so the serpent was the shrewdest of all of the wild beasts that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God really say you shall not eat of any tree of the garden? So the woman replied to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. Okay, so we can have any other tree. We can have that fruit, just not this one. It is only about fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, you shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die. Now, it could be that the man, actually, it's interesting. So God commanded Adam, saying, don't eat of it. If you eat of it, you will die. Now, Eve here says that actually it's not only eating, but even touching it. Now, it's unclear how she gets this notion of not touching it, because we don't see. What's fascinating is God doesn't directly tell her. I would imagine that that God told Adam, and then Adam may have told her, and that he may have even included the touching. So don't eat of it, and don't eat of it, and don't even think about touching it. So anyways, so the serpent then responds to the woman, saying, you are not going to die, but God knows that as soon as you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like divine beings who know good and bad. There's a lot to unpack there. It's unclear how this snake, knows this about the tree, but perhaps he knows something more than she does, or perhaps more than both she and Adam both know about this fruit of this tree. What's interesting is that he knows that there's sort of two aspects, that the eyes are going to be opened, that they're going to be somehow aware, they're going to be aware of something new, and that their eyes being opened will make them like gods, somehow divine beings who know good and bad. Now, it's interesting, what does good and bad mean? I would imagine it to be about morality being don't do bad things, do good things. That's the basic essence of good and bad, although I think I've heard people talking about good and bad as sort of being not moral good and bad, but aesthetics of good things and bad things, of sort of knowing. But I think the aspect of the divine beings really having a certain sense of morality. And it's actually unclear why that would be a bad thing. Like, why would God not want man and woman to know good and bad? Unclear. Maybe it's a threatening thing to be kind of like gods. Okay, unclear. Now what happens is then so somehow the snake convinces her, and so the woman saw that the tree was good for eating and a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom. She took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, and he ate. Before we even get to verse 7, because there's verse 7 is going to be really fascinating, but even verse 6 here in this third chapter is really also really interesting, because she sees that the tree was good for eating. Somehow she recognizes that it's not only edible fruit, but also very enjoyable. And then the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom. So it's unclear how she necessarily got that just from looking at it, but it may have been because of what the snake told her, that somehow she knew that they would be wiser on account of this. So she took of its fruit. She clearly touches it, and maybe what happened, it's very possible that she touched the fruit. She touched it, and the sit and being convinced by this snake saying, you know what? You touched the fruit and you did not die. Now she said, we touch it, we die. So clearly she touched it, not enough to kill her. It's all right. So then she ate it. So she ate it. She didn't die. So presume then she gives it to Adam. He also doesn't die. Okay. So that's just that one verse. That's just verse 6 there. But verse 7, really also fascinating. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they perceived that they were naked, and they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. So one of the really fascinating things here is how much the snake actually turns out to be correct here. I think that's a big twist of the story. We don't necessarily trust the snake, but he actually ends up being right, because yes, indeed, their eyes were opened. And it's interesting because he talks about it as knowing good and bad. Here we have that turns out they perceived they were naked. So that clearly is this sort of a new aspect of knowledge, knowing, I guess, to be naked is a not good thing, and to be clothed is a good thing. So what do? They seek to rectify this, and they sew together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. So they cover their private parts up, it seems. And now they are, I guess, on the side of good here, the side of morality, that they should be covered. It's also really fascinating the way this is positioned, that this is not something they knew of themselves, and clearly no other animals, no other living creatures around were covered. They were all naked. All living creatures were naked. It's not something that necessarily comes about just out of nature, but as something that they have to, I guess, I don't know, acquire from outside of themselves by eating of this tree of, as it were, of good. And it's interesting because right before I earlier read verse 18 in chapter 2, there is a name for it, which is very, very informing of us that oh yeah. So actually, I take that back. So going back to what it was, we talked about verse 17, the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Okay, so but it's interesting. Ki biyom achalcha mimenu mos tamus. On the day of it, the day that you eat it, you will die. So it's not when you eat it; it's on the day of your eating from it, then you will die. So that I just wanted to come back to that for us. But the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Okay, so that's what it's called. Knowledge of good and bad. Wonderful. And turns out the serpent was right. They are, it's interesting because God doesn't says you're going to be like me, you're going to be like gods. It's just it's the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Here, I guess maybe they are kind of like divine beings in some sense. I'm a little unclear on exactly how that works here, but ultimately their eyes are opened just as the snake had said, and this is clearly a matter of morality. And I also wonder if that's a certain sense of, you know, it's one thing to just sort of be living animals, but it's another to sort of have a sense of society, and that this is sort of, as the Torah imagines it, this is the creation of society, the creation of a certain sense of morality. What's fascinating is, again, it's not exactly when they eat of it, because going back to what Eve said, she says, "You shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die." Which, again, that's a little bit different than what we saw in chapter 2, because God told Adam on the day of your eating of it. Here, she says it's almost more immediate. And when she touched it, she didn't die. She ate it, she didn't die. So she gave it to Adam. She probably said, "Look, I touched it, I ate it, I'm alive. It's safe for you." So, um, little moment of suspense, because the story continues. Here we go. Then they heard the sound of the Lord God moving about in the garden at the breezy time of day. And the man and his wife hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. The Lord God called out to the man and said, "Where are you, Ayeka?" He replied, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, so I hid." Then God asked, "Who told you that you were naked?" It's interesting the way that God asked that. It almost seems as if God just wanted them to live a simple life. You don't need to know these things. Just enjoy life. Just be like all the other animals. Who told you this? God's not arguing that this indeed exists, that this is indeed a real thing. He just is really curious. Mihigid lecha ki erum ata. Who told you you're naked? Did you eat of the tree from which I had forbidden you to eat? You had one job, one mission. That's it. And you violated it. The man said, "Well, the woman you put at my side, she gave me of the tree, and I didn't do it on my own. It wasn't me. It's the woman's fault." So God's not happy with that. The Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman replied, "Well, the snake duped me and I ate." So everybody's trying to pass the buck here. Okay. There's a clear passing of the buck. The man said, "Well, it's the woman's fault." The woman says, "No, it's the snake's fault." So the Lord God said to the snake, "Because you did this, more cursed shall you be than all cattle and all the wild beasts. On your belly shall you crawl, and dirt shall you eat all the days of your life." That's not enough. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. Then you shall strike at your head. They shall strike at your head. You shall strike at their heel." Okay, so we've taken care of the snake, and this works actually in a really interesting fashion, because what we see is God goes to Adam. Adam blames it on the woman blames it on the snake. So now God's talking to the snake first. Now we're going to go to the woman. So we're sort of going in the opposite direction. And to the woman, he said, "I will make your childbirthing pains most severe. In pain you shall bear children. And yet your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And then to Adam, he said, so before we even get to Adam, it's fascinating that God had told Adam, Adam told Eve, Eve told the snake, and that's it. We're placing the blame that way, and the consequences come out in the reverse order, that God talks to the snake first. Snake, woman, man. It's the opposite order, which is really fascinating. So to Adam, he said, "Because you did as your wife said and ate of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed be the ground because of you. By toil shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it sprout for you, but your food shall be the grasses of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you get bread to eat until you return to the ground. For from it you are taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." This is, so we have these divine consequences, these direct divine consequences being given to snake, woman, man, in the exact opposite order, I guess, of sort of the sharing of the blame, as it were, or the pointing of the fingers. Fascinatingly, the consequences actually aren't over just yet, because the man named his wife Eve, or Chava, because she was the mother of all the living. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in English, but the Hebrew makes a lot better sense. That he called her Chava, ki hi haita aim ko chai. So there's the chai of living and Chava. So there's a sort of a similarity in sort of the name that Adam gives to his it's actually fascinating, because wife, it's not even clear. Wife is just a sort of a adaptation of Middle English for woman. So he calls his woman Chava. Okay. And again, we're not, the story isn't actually over. I think we think about all the punishments, but there's a little bit more, because this is where it gets really fascinating. In verse 21, the Lord God made garments of skins for Adam and his woman and clothed them. That's so fascinating, because they discovered, Adam and Eve discovered this knowledge that they were naked, right? They did this without God's consent, right? They did it behind God's back, so to speak. And God's really furious with them for finding this out. And yet we see, of course, Adam and Eve then sort of cover up their private parts, but then God helps clothe them. God provides garments that they should cover themselves up. So I think that's fascinating that God God says, you know what, you know now. And actually that we see that in the next verse, because the Lord God said, now that the man has become like one of us, just like the snake said, this is going to be a consequence. You're going to be like a God, knowing good and bad. Exactly. What if he should stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever? So God feels threatened now that man has somehow ascended from just like any other animal and is like a God. And he says, ooh, I'm a little worried about this. I'm threatened. So, and it seems like God does not want man to live forever. Okay. So the Lord God banishes Adam from the Garden of Eden to till the soil from which he was taken. He drove the man out and stationed. Okay. Then we have this cherubim stuff, these angels, the fiery, ever turning sword. It's a whole separate matter. I don't even know what that's about. Okay. Going back though, we have fruits. Fruits are, this whole story is about this fruit of the knowledge of good and fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And also, as the snake has warns about, that there's a certain also divine knowledge sense, or somehow similarity to being divine beings. This is all good. Okay, we've talked about this, but I think the most striking aspect of this entire story, if we're focusing just on the fruits, if we're just thinking about the fruit itself, we don't know. We just don't know what that fruit is. I do have to make mention here that there is, I think it's pretty common in our culture for whatever reason. I think it started in, I don't know, medieval art. I don't know if it was medieval Christian art or just, yeah, I think it was probably medieval Christian art. And somehow the fruit was an apple. It became described as an apple. There's nothing in the story that would necessarily specify apple. We don't know. It's just a fruit. And it could be, if we really take the literal sense of the story itself, it could just simply be that was a very special tree. It only existed in the Garden of Eden, and it really doesn't correspond to any fruit giving tree that we experience and otherwise come across in our world or our existence. So that very well could be. Now, if that's nice. So this is all really fascinating. This is all really all good and well. And we probably could stop here if we were just interested in just the text itself. But it is really fascinating. And I have mentioned previously in this series that the rabbis had what they called midrash, which I like to think of as narrative expansion, really thinking more broadly about what this text could be and what it means. So in as much as I did just mention that the rabbis that the text itself doesn't specify what this tree was beyond simply saying it's knowledge of good and bad, and that who knows, maybe there's no similar corresponding tree in our existence beyond the Garden of Eden, and that tree was just limited there and that's it. The rabbis are not happy with that. I mean, maybe they are happy, but they're really curious, and they have a midrash about what was this fruit. Does this fruit correspond to anything that we have, that we experience in our lives? So there is a early rabbinic text from the 2nd century of the Common Era that appears a couple of places in the Babylonian Talmud. For those keeping score at home, Bereshit 40a, also Sanhedrin 70b. And so there are 3 opinions here, 3 different opinions. The first is Rabbi Meir, and he says it was a vine. So it's a vine, meaning like a grapevine, because nothing brings wailing upon people other than wine, as it is stated, and quoting from the Noah story in Genesis chapter 9, he drank from the wine and became drunk, and bad stuff happens. So it could be grapes, even though, of course, the grapes had not yet fermented. But still, according to Rabbi Meir here, that these grapes were somehow indicative or otherwise symbolic of bringing wailing upon people, because as we see from this story involving Adam, that he ultimately, even though it's not necessarily in the text about crying, but clearly having to sweat things out and really toil for things, and no longer being in the Garden of Eden, is definitely not the same level of existence. Okay. So that is the first of these three opinions. The second, Rabbi Nehemiah says it was a fig. That's what it is. So he says, as with the object with which they were corrupted, they were rehabilitated, as it is stated, and they sewed together fig leaves, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it, and for a few reasons. Okay, one is the reason that Rabbi Nehemiah himself gives, which is that they fixed it up. They made an error and they fixed it up with what they made an error. So they sort of they fix it. The second, so that's the only thing that we see there. But I think there are two other things. One, which is that if it was right there, right? If you just ate from a fig tree and you realize that you were naked, so you just grab the thing, you just grab these fig leaves because they're right there, they're right nearby, they're convenient. So that's the second reason. And the third reason is, if you've ever seen fig leaves before, you know that they do a good job of covering that. So fig leaves are well, let's just say they do a good job. They do a good job of covering that particular area. That's I'll just leave it at that. Now the third is Rabbi Yehuda. Now this is a very curious opinion, and even the rabbis themselves really have pushback against this opinion. But Rabbi Yehuda says it was wheat. That was the tree, or that was the fruit of the tree, because he says the child does not know how to call his father and mother until he tastes the taste of grain. Now, I will just simply say the rabbis are like, wait a second, wheat is not a tree. There's a whole bunch of issues with that opinion. It's a really interesting opinion. But I'm really fascinated by that, which is, we have these three opinions: the wheat by Rabbi Yehuda, strange one; Rabbi Meir talking about grapes, and then you may have your own opinions. You can form your own opinions. I really like Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion, which was a fig leaf. I will say, so not in the Babylonian Talmud. So I mentioned this text appears with these three opinions, but there actually is another. This text appears with another idea somewhere. I think it's in somewhere else in Midrashic literature, where they talk about an etrog being perhaps one of the possibilities of this fruit of this tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is really fascinating. I don't exactly know why they say that, but I happen to have an etrog on hand. So we have these opinions, but guess what? None of these opinions in the Talmud, none of them. The rabbis do not mention apples at all. It didn't even occur to the rabbis that this would be this fruit. But I don't exactly know artistic history. So if someone out there knows their art history, perhaps their medieval art history, you might know the origins or how this got started, that apples were sort of conceived or otherwise conceptualized as the fruit of this tree of knowledge of good and evil. But I don't know how that got started. So fun fact, even though we all talk about, I think, in sort of Western culture, about the fruit, the sort of the forbidden fruit that Adam and Eve ate from that particular tree might have been apples. It certainly, there's nothing in the text that would suggest it. Certainly nothing in the Talmud amongst rabbinic literature and midrash to suggest that. So those are some other possibilities. Well, I hope that was insightful and informative. Something we've probably heard before. I don't think this is a story that's totally new. And if it is a totally new story to you, I'm very excited that I got to share that with you. But for those who have heard this story before, hopefully this provides a totally new angle, a new perspective, and certainly a new and more clear understanding that we don't know precisely what exactly this fruit was of this tree of knowledge of good and evil. But certainly it seemed to be, I mean, this is the most fascinating thing to me, is it's almost like a morality tree. I don't know if anybody else translates that Hebrew as I do, but I think of this as the morality tree. It's the knowledge of good and evil. You know what's good, you know what's bad, and you know what you should do, you know what you should stay away from. So, but ultimately, they also kind of become like gods. They have a divine knowledge. The snake tells them, and ultimately God's concerned about that. And that's why he says, you got to get out of the garden. I don't want you eating from a fruit of a different tree, the fruit of the tree of life, because then humans might live forever. So ultimately, I do want to say that even so, you might say, well, God did warn in the second chapter. He warned Adam that on the day that he eats of it, he will die. And yet we see that they live. In fact, they keep living. But ultimately, it turns out that it does work out to be correct, because they find out they are mortal, right? They find out that they will die. So God basically says, you know what, you will die. Okay, so maybe not literally on the day, but sort of like you will die. You find out that you will die, that you will be mortal, and we cannot live forever. Okay, so with that, I hope this was insightful. I hope this was a fruitful discussion.
I enjoyed that thoroughly. Your explanation was very clear.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. You have a great day.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed, Debbie.
Oh, I did. I love it.
Okay, with that, I want to wrap up by saying thank you so much for watching. Thank you for tuning in. And also, I want to mention all Jewish life and programming here at Cedar Village are financially sponsored by the Jewish Home of Cincinnati. So thank you so much. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for watching, and Shabbat Shalom.